7:30. Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I
pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, a roll call, please.
Mark Conlon, absent. Darrell Lewandowski.
Here.
T.J. McLaughlin, absent.
Absent,
And
she's
Malone.
excused. Here.
Bruce Reed here. Robert Rizzo.
Here.
Brian Legary.
Here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Approval of the agenda.
Make a motion to approve the agenda as written.
Second.
All those in favor of approving the agenda as written for January 27, 2020, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? None? Okay. Election of officers.
I'd like to make a motion if I could.
Okay.
Chairperson I'm recommending is Pam Merlot, Vice Chair Bruce Reeves, and Secretary Dan Vigari. Huh?
No. I just put you as vice chair.
Don't have a second. So what do we do with that?
If there's no second, then the motion dies and we'll need another motion.
Okay. Okay.
I make a motion that we elect the same officers that we have.
I'll second that.
Okay. For seconds. Okay, do we need a roll call vote for this? Alrighty.
I think you can just do it.
Oh, okay. All those in favor of, for the election of officers for 2020, Pam Merlot, Chairperson, Dan Vergary, Vice Chair, and Bruce Reeve, Secretary. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? None? Passes. Public comment. Okay. I know, that's always surprising, isn't it? And I believe Miss Kress has just walked in. Hi, how are you? It's nice to see you again. Chris Olson is from the Huron River Watershed Council, and she was contacted by Bruce to come and speak to us in ways that may help us with maybe make some suggestions, or I know you've kind of reviewed our master plan in regards to ordinances.
Yes.
And we have
This
seen you
is,
before. You've been here probably
yes.
about, what, 5 years now?
Yeah, maybe. So yeah, I wanted to ask, I have a presentation that I can give, that I gave as part of a workshop to the Land Preservation Committee, and we did a green infrastructure workshop,
Okay.
and then I came to the Planning Commission and talked about that. And so I have a slide presentation that has some of that information and some other information, so, I can show that if you like, and then we can talk about some of the recommendations that we, are bringing to you, having to do with what, you can work on your zoning ordinance, master plan, to help protect the watershed.
Okay, we've already just had our master plan approved.
Right,
But I
right.
think we're updating some of our
The zoning.
ordinances and
Yeah.
whatnot,
So
so.
what can we do to
So
get
let's-
you up and running here? Not yet. We're gonna need to see for this. We've got an extension cord.
I offered help, but it wouldn't be any help, unfortunately.
There is not?
Closest is to the wall.
What about that one right there?
I think we've got one right over
Well,
here.
let's not get too excited, because I think
Uh-oh.
that's the only other cord that I have.
So this doesn't,
Yeah.
juice, huh?
That's really interesting. Looks like you guys got,
Auditory.
what do you guys got out of it?
A cord to give.
Looks like you're gonna have to watch me wave my hands
You
around.
have a bunch of cords?
Is it a power cord?
You need the
Yeah,
power cord that
for
plugs into the back of this
a
thing.
projector that happens to be the same sort of projector.
There should be somebody
I
there
can-
that knows you can find it.
I can start, and then we can see if we can get you some visuals. How about that?
Okay.
Sounds
Okay?
I don't know
So,
where down
as
the
I
easel go,
mentioned-
that's good. Store-
Because I know that you like to get through your agenda. I'm a planning commissioner myself. So you might remember that we did a green infrastructure workshop.
You didn't like that idea of being vice chair?
It's probably in the room.
Easel?
Yeah, that'd be great.
They have an easel back there?
Oh, I was gonna do it that way.
Is there an easel back there?
Yeah.
And is there an easel back there?
An easel?
This one extends out. I don't know if this other one, but this one is really big. Yeah, there's one.
There's an easel
We're
there.
not being business here.
Oh, okay, great.
I've got a hard floor over there by a couple elevators. So
Yeah, let's just do that.
Hold it in place.
Well, it looks like we're gonna get the
there we go.
presentation going.
Oh, okay.
So we can start with that. And we have the easel. And we can use our clip spruce for the easel.
Do you still need a power
Where do
cord?
you want this?
Let's see if this can make it. I think we're good.
Yeah. There we go, yeah.
Got it?
Good.
Perfect.
Do you have clips on there?
I'll put this over to my right.
Boy, I gotta wear my other glasses.
Now you got a new one.
Yeah.
This is apparently an extra, so.
Oh, really?
And there's some clips, more clips
Where
here.
would you like this? Which
Put it
facing
back-
which way?
let's put
Over
it right
here?
here.
So,
So
yeah.
everybody can see?
Yeah.
Okay. Can you see it?
Oh, yeah, I had to put these other ones on.
Oh, we've got those two.
I think in the interim, I have to go down. and sit
Yeah, I
with you,
sure
Because I won't be able to see.
Ready for me to turn the light on?
Then when it comes that one, I'll just move back down here.
Is that enough light off or?
We need to move our table closer to the street.
You know, see what they open next time.
Yeah.
And because I didn't want him, thank you, Robert. I didn't want to go fast.
Should we go back to the end of the
You
cord
know,
You there?
Yeah, we're pretty close.
We're not even supposed to be here. Our thing's expired.
Yeah, I've got another problem. Why isn't it not?
He changes it. It goes on until he.
We can move it. a little
Well, I
further.
asked Paul, because I told him
There you
the
go.
other day, I'm like, what happened?
Yeah, I didn't care if Bruce wants to be a vice chair, it's fine by me.
Hey,
I just-
you guys are-
I don't even care.
I just thought it-
You guys-
I just didn't.
Pam.
push it.
Yes.
Your microphone's on and everything's being,
Oh, okay. That's
I'm
fine.
just gonna sit here.
Oh, okay.
That way I can see better.
Okay.
okay.
If he shows up, well, then Tell me he's quarantined.
Tell him he's bad and he's got to sit next to the chairman.
Okay, yeah.
Sitting-
Still too late. I guess so.
Sure we don't get the end of our road.
That's good enough. I just better come over here and stay over here.
I mean, you could just,
Okay, so I have just a couple of slides about the Watershed Council. I think you're all familiar with Huron River Watershed Council. We're Michigan's oldest watershed council, and we're a coalition of local communities and residences established way back in 1965. And we protect the Huron River as well as its tributary streams, lakes, wetlands, and groundwater, so not just the river. And we have lots of different programs, including green infrastructure, which I'm talking about today. And we also work with volunteer monitoring. We have many, over 500 volunteers, I think, who go out and monitor the streams. In fact, just this Saturday, they're going out to look for stoneflies in the streams in the middle of winter. We work to make our communities more resistant to climate change. We work on a lot of volunteer programs with river cleanups and education, so I urge you all to check out our website, a lot going on. And so tonight I'm going to talk about protecting Salem's natural assets as part of, I know you have your Parks and Open Space plan coming along, so that fits in really well with the kinds of things we're talking to communities about. And I've read the master plan as well, and there are a lot of really good things in the master plan. And so what are the benefits of protecting these natural assets? So these natural areas help keep our drinking water clean, they help with stormwater and flooding control, wildlife habitat, scenic views. You've probably all heard this before, I bet. You see people nodding their heads. You have beautiful rural character out here and a great deal of farmland and recreation. I read the survey on the open space plan, and there is a lot of interest in recreation and trails and that kind of thing. And so they do support a healthy economy. So that's one of the great reasons of protecting land. And it's not just because we like to protect land, but it actually has economic benefits. This is a study that we did in the Huron watershed, the economic value of the Huron River itself. And so just the Huron River itself, not the whole watershed, but just the river itself and some, half a mile on either side of the river, produces $53.5 million in annual economic output. You can read those numbers, but they broke it down by county, and it's not just the recreation and the economic benefit, but it's also the economic value of the ecosystem services that wetlands are providing that are along the river and that the water quality is providing. The Huron River provides drinking water to the city of Ann Arbor. All of the people in Salem, right, get their drinking water from the groundwater. Groundwater is resupplied by those natural areas, so that provides a lot of economic, of course, and public health benefit. So what does it mean? What does land protection mean, and why do we need to protect natural areas and keep as much of those natural ecosystems going as possible? Well, a lot of it has to do with polluted runoff, stormwater runoff, and the more water that's running off the land, the less water that's infiltrating into the ground to resupply that groundwater. And so if you think about your typical woodland, very little runoff prior to development, right? Most of the water is intercepted by the woods or the soils and the leaf litter. when you're in more of a situation like this, which you see the palm trees, it's not really here in Michigan, but you get the idea, you don't have that water naturally infiltrating. And this is a graphic that kind of shows what I'm talking about is sort of, if you don't have development, you have all of those ecosystem services happening and the water cycle is cycling through. Rainwater is intercepted by the trees, there's evapotranspiration of that, a lot of it goes down into the earth and recharges our groundwater. When you have more impervious surfaces and houses and lawns, more of that rainwater goes off as surface runoff and it carries whatever pollutants it picks up with it straight into the river. And then you can look at this by the numbers. So in creek sheds where you have very low levels of impervious surface, like a lot of parts of Salem Township, in fact, under 10% impervious surface, you have nice natural looking streams. Low banks, you have a natural buffer, so it's shaded. There's good habitat for the creatures that live in the creek, which makes it good habitat for fish. The water's cool because it's being recharged by groundwater, and it's clear because it's not getting all that pollution running into it. Once you reach 10 to 25% impervious surface, you get higher banks because when it rains, a lot of that storms down into the creek. It scours the bottom of the creek and it creates more sediment. You have less diverse habitat because of that. So all of the creatures that live in the creek, the macroinvertebrates or bugs, they live in those little creeks creases in between rocks and gravel and leaf litter. If all that's covered by dirt and sediment, it can't live there. And the water's warmer because that water's coming straight from the roads. It's not coming from that cool groundwater. When you get over 25% impervious surface, this is Miller's Creek, which runs through Ann Arbor. You get all really eroded banks because all of those things I just talked about happen more and more. It's very little habitat and the water is warm, and that word under there is flashy. So when it rains, it's a gushing, flooding deluge, and when it doesn't rain, there's no water. And so the trends for Southeast Michigan and the Huron Watershed is that these open spaces that we do enjoy, and the Huron Watershed actually still has quite a few open spaces still, farmland and natural areas, and that's one of the main reasons why it's still in very good shape, aside from the PFAS issue, which is very depressing. But in terms of having clean, cool water that has good wildlife habitat in it, it's still doing pretty good for especially for an urbanizing stream. But the future is saying that future trends are saying that 40% of that remaining open space is projected to be developed in some way. Our master plans and zoning ordinances, and there are 67 different communities in the watershed. Build outs, if you do build outs of what the zoning says is allowed to be built, there's little designated natural area, and almost all natural areas, as in almost all land in Michigan, is in some sort of private ownership designated for some kind of use in our zoning ordinances. And this is not quite the same as it was when I first made this slide, but many development patterns, and certainly typical development patterns, are kind of low density. They use up a lot of land per person. So 2 5-acre lot, 1-acre lot development uses up a lot of land, converts a lot of farmland and natural area into development. And so we're seeing fragmentation of natural areas, we're seeing loss of wetlands in particular, loss of certain kinds of woodlands in particular. And so one of our key messages is to maintain the watershed's health. What we want to do actually is encourage higher density where the infrastructure already exists, because it's more efficient if you think about it. How many more people, we're going to have growth. People are going to be moving in, moving out, moving around. So you need to provide for development. The best way to do it is to provide it in an efficient way. And then secondly, preserving natural areas so they can continue to keep that water clean. So in other words, developing in areas where you already have development and trying to stay away from areas of high quality natural ecosystems. This is another way of looking at it. What we like to see communities doing is protecting the natural areas, kind of like the prevention. An ounce of prevention is better than a pound of cure. Once you do have development, you want to do what you can to design it so you're using less impervious surface per household, say. And then when you do end up developing, there you can use green infrastructure, human-made green infrastructure, like stormwater systems that allow water to infiltrate, rain gardens, natural landscaping, green rooftops, things like that. Pervious surfaces, pervious pavement for parking lots, that kind of thing to kind of offset the impacts of that development. So that's kind of the pyramid structure. And so we put together a little top 10 things we like to see local communities do to protect water quality. Let me get my... So, I know that Bruce asked me on the phone if I could come up with one action that the township could work on, one or two main actions, and I created a paper for you guys to read. It starts from that zoning ordinance elements worksheet that I showed you probably maybe 4 or 5 years ago when I came up before, where we looked at your master plan and zoning ordinance, and we made did basically an audit based on the kinds of elements that land use planners and watershed experts like to see in zoning ordinances to maintain water quality. And so I presented that to you at that time. And so I tried to come up with sort of the top few that I think would be great to get a start on, to work on. And so that's what this is. These are the kind of top 10. So I'll go over these and then I'll go over this a little bit too. So people here remember David Letterman, right? He had his late night show and he always had the top 10. So I'm going to go over the top 10. So it goes from lowest to highest, of course. So we start with number 10, and you have this. So even just knowing where your natural features, where your natural areas are in your zoning map is very helpful. So because as your planning commission, you guys look at development proposals on a case-by-case basis. And so it's good to have a map like this, which you do. This is an example from Webster of where those natural areas are. So that's great. And these are the communities that we know of in our watershed that have done this. So you're in good company. And then another good thing to do is to have open space zoning. So you have your zoning in your various kinds of residential and agricultural zoning, and allowing, and you do it through PUD in your zoning ordinance, but allowing developers to do it in a more efficient way, right, on a site-by-site basis. So say you have 2 or 3 acre lot zoning, they still maintain that same overall density, but they can group the homes together so that they're preserving more of those natural features. And this is an example from Ann Arbor Township. They have a bunch of different, I think they have 3 different provisions for how to do this, and one of them, they have these different dedicated open space requirements depending on what zoning category that you're in. And these are the communities that we've worked with that have done this. Hamburg, I believe, was kind of a pioneer in this. And you have this as a PUD. These communities that have the little happy faces have it, but they have, they don't do it strictly through your PUD. They do it as another, it's an overlay zone, so they don't need to go through a PUD process in order to achieve it. And so it's not quite as onerous for the developer, and a couple of them also provide incentives, density incentives to do it, so that there's a little, you're kind of encouraging it. It's not just that you're allowing it. And then overlay districts, so that's something that you would do where you have the existing zoning and you overlay an extra provision on top of it. And so, for instance, in Webster Township and in Scioto Township, they have overlay zones. In Webster, the overlay zoning is along all of their waterways. So if there's a parcel that's along Arms Creek, it has the residential R2, R1, whatever that is, but it also has, in their case, they have a 100-foot setback requirement from building, how far away you need to build from the waterway. And so that's an overlay. In Scioto Township's case, they actually have an overlay district for all of the natural areas in their township. So wherever you see those green shapes, those polygons, those are woodlands and wetlands in their township, and those are overlay districts. So all the parcels that are within those green areas need to provide a little more information and abide by certain rules that have to do with protecting those natural features. And so these are communities that have overlay zones. Another, and this is setbacks and buffers, so it's kind of the same as an overlay zone, but instead of having an overlay zone, it's in your zoning ordinance as its own sort of chapter, natural features setback section. And so for instance, Ann Arbor Township requires 100-foot setback and then a 25-foot vegetated strip from every waterway. That is probably our number one recommendation from the Watershed Council. If all of the communities in our watershed had that, if we could have space for the creeks to provide their ecosystem services, if they could have a buffer of woods and wetland areas, that would go a long way to keeping those waterways clean. If you have a buffer between lawns and the waterway, that helps to filter pollutants out of stormwater. It helps provide groundwater recharge. So that, to us, that's the number one thing we like to see communities make sure that they're doing, is allowing the stream to have some buffer between it and development. So this is an example of Ann Arbor Townships again. I'm a planning commissioner there, so it's easy for me to get their language. They also have a steep slope protection setback. It's not a setback from steep slopes, but it's a building. You're not allowed to build on a steep slope without a permit. So that's another kind of natural feature that you could consider protecting. And these are communities that have this kind of setback and buffer requirement. And then there's minimizing impact on the site level through stormwater requirements, and you have a stormwater ordinance. And so that's great. So communities are doing that. So a lot of communities are also connecting their zoning requirements, their stormwater rules to the Washtenaw County Water Resources Commissioner rules. Those are the most innovative rules that we've seen in the state so far. And so when there's a development that's going to happen within a jurisdiction of the Water Resources Commissioner's office, they really have very good provisions. So a lot of the townships have linked their stormwater review to the Washtenaw County Stormwater Review, so that you don't have to think about all those engineering provisions. You have them do it. Again, this is Ann Arbor Township's zoning or stormwater ordinance example. And then these, of course, I put down all the ones that were in the county. So they have the Washtenaw County's lucky in that they have the Washtenaw Water Resources Commissioner's rules. And then a wetlands ordinance. You have a wetlands ordinance, which is great. Wetlands are incredibly important, more so than even other natural features. So that's great. All the brown colored townships and the city of Ann Arbor too have wetland ordinances. So that's a great thing. We'd like to see more of that throughout our watershed. Site plan review to reduce impervious surface. So there's all kinds of things within the site plan review that can be done to reducing how big a parking space needs to be, road width decreases, road width, narrowing road widths. I know that the County Road Commission is really in charge of most of the roads here. Do you have a private road ordinance?
Yes.
Do you have private roads as well in the township?
Yes.
Yeah, so in your private road ordinance, you could look at, well, how wide do these roads really need to be? So there are a lot of little things you can do in your zoning ordinance to minimize impervious surfaces. And so these are communities that have done that. And then we're getting into the really important stuff. We're getting to that bottom of that pyramid, not necessarily what to do with the development on site, but where does that development happen? And so green infrastructure planning, so that's this map. So that, I was mentioning when I started, we did do a green infrastructure workshop with the township. There we are with the maps on the bottom. That's the Land Preservation Committee. And so you have in your township mapped out what your green infrastructure is. So these are where your important woodlands and wetlands and a network connecting those. Usually the connections are through water features like creeks and wetlands. So you have this, and you have a very similar map in your master plan, the natural areas section. So that's really, I see very few townships that have a natural land preservation whole section in their master plan, which is great. So I think you have a lot of provisions already set up for this kind of thing. And so I just brought this tonight so we could take a look at it again. And then these are other communities that have done similar green infrastructure planning. And then future land use map determines the pattern of land use, and so having a master plan that has this kind of pattern, which is Salem Township, you have an urban services district and a hamlet planning area, which I think is great, because that is where you're planning to have more of your people living in perhaps a way where they don't always need to be in a car, not taking up so much land, and then you have agriculture and open space more in the main part of the township. So I like to see that pattern of future land use maps. And then I don't know what that's. Oh yeah, okay, so this is an example of what other communities use this green infrastructure planning for. And so there's all kinds, like the master plan, you guys are already doing that. Open space millage, I'll talk about that in a second. And the recreation planning, so you're doing your open space and recreation plan. Park acquisitions, I know you're looking at some areas for acquiring. And coordinating with conservancies, I know you talk about that in both of your master plan and your parks plan. Native landscaping, and Bruce and I talked about that a little bit on the phone, so that's another avenue. And building partnerships, and I know you've worked a lot with the county natural areas preservation program and the conservancies. And then these are communities that have what I would say are master plans that have that sort of, are looking for that sort of pattern of future land use. So what's the number one? So we want to protect natural areas and guide development to compact communities. So it's what that key message was that I was talking about. This set of drawings shows paintings or fake aerials, shows the sort of contrast of what I'm talking about. So the picture on the left is sort of you can see there's a small bit of settlement there on the left side, but most of it is open space, farmland, some natural areas. The middle picture is what typically kind of happens. Development kind of spreads out all over the landscape. And whereas the third picture is same number of, say, households, people, but they're still in that sort of left part of the picture. And so you see you can preserve a lot more natural areas and open space by carefully planning where development's going to be in your community. So that's the one that you get the most bang for your buck. And this is just a graphical way of looking at it. You get, say, 20,000 homes accommodated on 20,000 acres, it's going to spread out and take, the equivalent of 2 watersheds. Whereas if you put them on 5,000 acres, it's going to take up half of 1 watershed. And then you can do the math and take different amounts of densities, just simply showing you that the higher density you have, the less land you take up. Now, I know you have a PDR ordinance, and so I wanted to talk to you about that a little bit. So we're working with communities to see how we can do more land protection and how we can fund more land protection through innovative ways. One of those ways would be to have a land protection millage, like City of Ann Arbor does with the Green Belt, and then of course Washtenaw County has a county-wide one. Ann Arbor Township, Scioto Township, they have a millage. So I thought I would bring that up as one method of protecting land. We do have a toolkit for this. We had a workshop last year, and it kind of goes over all the things a township would do if they wanted to do a millage campaign. So there is support if there's interest in this township for doing that. And this is hard to see because of we never got it small enough, but the idea of this table is that the land that's open now, something's gonna happen to it. It's either gonna get developed in some way, or if the township does have a land protection program, you could be purchasing conservation easements on it and keeping it from being as developed. And this is just kind of pointing out that one way or the other, the township will have to pay. So if the township chooses not to invest in land protection, they'll end up investing in the residential development because those homes will be built and you need to provide services and eventually taxes will have to be paid to take care of that. Or if you invest in the natural areas and farmland now, there will be a cost per household. And this is hard to see because it didn't fit on the thing, but the cost per household is quite similar either way. So one way you get the development and the cost, and the other way you get the conservation easements and the cost. So that's something just to keep in mind. And then there's other potential ways to protect land. This is a program that we're working on right now. There's lots of different funding mechanisms. There's wetland mitigation banking that we're looking into. Natural Resource Conservation Service, which used to be called the Soil Conservation Service, has source water protection funding. So so that's funding for protecting sources of drinking water, which is your groundwater. There's the Drinking Water State Revolving Loan Fund, which is looking into providing funding for land protection that protects these ecosystem services, that protects those drinking water sources, and then you have less treatment costs to clean up the pollution. And so we're looking into these different funding mechanisms, and so I'll keep you posted on that. And the other way, I know Bruce and I talked a little bit about, you've talked a little bit about solar programs being proposed and wind programs being proposed, and I know there was some talk about community septic, so I just want to let you know we have some examples of those if you'd like to see them as well. That, again, I took them from Ann Arbor Township because we went through very similar issues just recently. And you asked about marijuana too, and I actually have some examples from Ann Arbor Township. We've been going through the same issue. And now I'm ready for questions, or actually let me hand this out. Or do you have any questions while I hand this out?
What's the present status on the contamination right now?
The PFAS?
Yeah.
It's actually, the levels have gone down quite a bit. Once they found a source that they've really, they put in a filtration system, a cleanup system, and that seems to be making a big difference. There you go. And if anybody else would like one, we've got extra ones. Would you like one?
My husband has one. He's out
Oh,
there.
okay, great.
So you
Go
found,
back to that last slide. Could you
Yes.
just put the last slide up?
This one?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
I was gonna say, you found the origin of that?
Yeah, it was a metal plating facility in Wixom. And,
Still in operation?
yes, but they put in a filtration system that's removing the PFAS before it goes into because they have a permit to discharge to the wastewater treatment plant at Wixom. And so but now they have a filtration system there, and Wixom's got their filtration system, and I believe Ann Arbor put in more filtration as well. So you can filter it out. It'll take a while for it to move through the system though, so in terms of the fish consumption advisory, that's gonna be for a while.
So I know we did our open space plan, and we did have a lot of folks respond to the survey.
Mhm.
And again, our rural community and our open spaces are, people want to keep them. There's a little bit of, pluses and minuses for the recreation, for organized sports, but other
Right,
than that,
yep.
it seemed to be, positive towards trying to maintain the rural community.
Right.
I think it's a little different thinking than most of us have as far as that density, we keep
Yep.
thinking density, bad.
Right, right.
But in terms of protecting, if you have a total density for the township, you know, it's all gonna be here and here, not,
Right, yeah. I
So-
think the idea of careful planning is a good, people tend to like that idea of, it's not that you're forcing one thing or the other, but you have it, it's something in your master plan so that people know what to expect.
so a lot of us enjoy the properties that we do have and
Yeah.
the open spaces that we do have individually and collectively, they actually connect up.
Yes,
And whatnot, so it's still somewhat maintaining that, but,
Mhm.
how do we go about still, allowing that, but
Mhm.
still, like I said, doing the right things as well. It's, right now, this generation that's in there now, well, we like that, and we're,
Yep.
seem to be taking care of it to a certain degree.
Mhm.
But I can see that, as some of the, people get older, and then
Mhm.
they pass that on to the
Right.
kids, and the kids go, oh, I got 10 acres, I can divvy that up into 5 lots.
right, right,
And all of a sudden, they're trying to force an extra home or two on
right.
a parcel, and especially if we get community septic ordinances or septic systems in there, all of a sudden, there's a pressure to build a little bit denser, even though we're staying within that 2 acre minimum, all of a sudden, now we're gonna get potentially chopped up into a lot of 2 acres.
Right, right.
Instead of
Right, I
maybe-
mean, it's never been, I've never seen a proposal come in that's asking, if you get rezoning proposals, they almost always ask for a higher density, right? They don't ever ask to go to a lower density. So if anything, if you take your zoning map and look at what you think the future's gonna hold, it'll be at least that many homes. It'll be at least that many parcels, is however many acres per lot that you've allowed as it is, probably more, because like you said, people will want to split it up into more.
Well, one of the things that slows it down is the fact that we have a difficulty in getting perks for
Right,
septic, so some of these things could tend to push that a little denser if we have alternate ways for getting the grounds to
Right.
perk.
right.
Um,
Well, the way Ann Arbor Township did the community septic ordinance is it's only allowed if it's, the reason for doing it is to preserve open space. So, for instance, if we had one proposal that they wanted to preserve 80% of the whole thing as farmland and open space, but then they would have to put the houses closer together than what individual septics would allow, because you need like an acre per lot. So they put in a community septic system that was basically it's the septic field was in an open area, and they all hooked up to it. But the only way they would be allowed to do that is because they were preserving open space.
So what is the responsibility of the township if there's a community septic system and it fails? Now I got 5
Yep.
or 10 residents going like, someone's gotta do something about this.
Yeah, and it's in the ordinance, what would happen, all the steps you have to take for that.
Because I think one of the things that's,
Because it wasn't something that the township was very happy about allowing. Yeah.
that's one thing we're fearful of, is just the ownership of having to deal with something that goes wrong
Right.
after the fact.
Yep.
Developer's gone,
Right.
and homeowners
Right.
can't afford to fix it on their own. And
Right,
all of a sudden they're looking for someone to help them fix it, or
Right.
it goes unchecked even.
right.
And
So,
causes.
yeah, so our township's been through that, so that we'd be happy to talk with you guys
Okay,
more
for
if you wanted to go into it.
Who paid for the issue that Ann Arbor Township had that
Okay.
didn't go well?
Well-
Wasn't there one that didn't go well?
No, they've never had a problem that I know of with a community septic failing. There were lots of them in Livingston County, from what I remember, back in the 90s, I think.
Oh, that's not what I was thinking.
Ultimately, the state act that allows for these, the local municipality is the last line of defense, so.
Right.
If the developer's gone, if the
It's the
neighborhood can't
township.
figure out how to do it,
Yep.
then the township would be
That was my
responsible.
understanding
And
as
so
well.
so our ordinance
And there's
has
no getting around
provisions
it.
in it that make that much less likely, so that the homeowners association is much more responsible.
Yeah, well, the homeowners would just divvy it up percentage-wise, and how many homes are there and what has to be repaired, right?
if they can't pay.
That'd be a pretty expensive endeavor though, if it's
So
multi.
Yep. Yeah.
we've drafted an ordinance, obviously, that hasn't moved forward necessarily, but one of the provisions is constant monitoring, and that those individuals responsible for it keep a certain amount of money to pay for
Right.
the monitoring and pay for the maintenance. So ideally, it's designed to work, but it does
Right.
make it more cumbersome, like the Ann Arbor Township ordinance, so that people really have to consider it seriously before they go
Yeah,
to.
yeah, exactly.
What do they do when Paul, furthest to Paul if I could,
Yes.
when they gotta replace the whole field? You're talking about a lot of money.
It is, yes, it's very expensive. So that's why there's the requirement for the constant monitoring, and there's amount of money that's supposed to be kept based on the size of the system, so that it would pay for those ongoing repairs and then ultimate replacement if need be.
It's definitely something you have to, like you said, consider carefully. And that's why they have it in, that's the only time it's ever been used, actually, since it's been in existence, is that one development. So, it's not something that's done without a lot of consideration.
And Chris, if I'm correct, didn't the developer opt to not do that for the second phase of their development?
Correct. Yeah.
Because the first part was.
Yeah,
so
well,
difficult.
so that, and then also that had a lot to do with when we had the recession, because they started development before the recession and they finished it after the recession, so markets have changed since then. And
Any other question on that?
I know that the builder had proposed that, to put in a community septic system here several years back here, and they flooded this hall in opposition to it.
I bet, yeah.
Yeah, they flooded it down, and
Yeah.
I was one of them.
If Bruce brought those up, did you have any, like, kind of some brief commentary, like what we just did with the community septic on your solar, wind, and marijuana? Why are those up
The
there?
marijuana, I don't want to talk about, because it's such a pain in the, we go back and forth in our township, I don't know if you've done the same thing.
Nobody get the new stuff
Then
every
you get
month.
the new,
you know?
right, so we're still working back and forth, and you never know when the state rules, now the state rules are out, and so, we're struggling with it as a rural, and we consider us as a rural township, we're surrounding Ann Arbor City. So I think the upshot on what we have provisions and licensing, we're still opted out at this point. We went through a whole medical marijuana ordinance, development a few years ago, so we had that in place. But for the recreational, we're still opted out and still working on it.
Want to go to the city?
Yeah.
The reason why I brought those up in particular is our community has a lot of open space, but it's farmland. I'm noticing less and less is being farmed. And therefore, in fact, some of the families, as dynamics change in the family, some people are not, maybe there's 4 brothers and sisters own the property, but when mom and dad pass, now all of a sudden someone's got to buy the other one out.
Yep.
And now, so there might be some change in hands or less
Yeah.
farming going on. So we have this property that's out there, and there are some of the things that are common to pop up on large open spaces, our solar
Yeah.
farms, wind farms, and of course, the community septic was one. And then the marijuana, the reason I brought that up is this Blake's Orchard and Cider Mill branching out to a new crop.
Oh, really? Okay, I was wondering about that, because I've been told that it's difficult to grow in this climate.
Well, the point is that, we're going to potentially see
Yeah.
different uses of this farmland, because again, from a commercial standpoint, our farms are still broken up. We have a lot, because of that natural spaces, it doesn't make sense for the very large commercial farmers to bring that equipment in, because they gotta move around.
Yep, yep.
We got a lot of smaller parcels, so it's it's more of a family, local farming
Right,
type
right.
community. It's
Yeah.
very difficult to, I would think, try and convince someone to come in and farm 400 or 500 acres, because
Yeah.
they can't,
Right.
it's not all contiguous property, it's not a nice sprawling flatland.
And I
So,
know up in the Thumb area, a lot of farmers are putting the wind turbines in, and that gives them extra revenue, so they can keep farming. And our township has a wind wind facility ordinance that we feel allows that sort of thing, it allows the smaller, we have provisions that have to do with the real tall, big turbines, and then with the ones people would like to have in their own yard as well, so you can take a look at what they did.
Yep.
So,
Right,
and then I
so
just
we're gonna
wanted
address
to
that later on.
point out, so Bruce asked for me to talk about one action, but I came up with 5. And so that's these bullets here in the front. But again, I'll just repeat that having a 100-foot setback from waterways, I think would be a really good first step. And you have a 50-foot setback already, which is great. But 100-foot would bring you in line with the other townships in the area. And it is really what's recommended as almost a minimum for a building setback from a waterway.
Is that on both sides?
Mhm.
100, so it's 200 feet?
Well, it's 100-foot, sure. So if you can imagine, if this is the creek and you have fertilizers and pesticides, 20 feet, 25 feet, the rain's gonna wash it into the creek. Also, if you're not building this far away from the creek, you can let this grow up into native landscaping and trees and shrubs, and that's gonna filter any of the oils or pesticide fertilizers, whatever's running off of either your yard or driveways or the roadway. So, of course, if you want on the other side too, because there's also land use going on the other side, so, yeah. It does seem like a lot, but we did a couple of, analyses of the actual, how much it would take out of your, any given parcel, and it doesn't really have that huge of an impact on sort of buildability. I can show you that analysis too, we did it for Dexter Township.
What's your next one?
And then the other one would be the vegetated buffer. So once you do your 100-foot setback, requiring a 25-foot of that setback be left in more native landscaping. And so not mowing all the way to the edge of the waterway. And so those first two are kind of very similar. And then the other one would be that overlay zone I showed you that Scioto Township has, looking into doing that, you've got it in your master plan and you've got it in your zoning ordinance where the natural areas are. So coming up with an overlay zone of what of these areas would you consider requiring sort of having any petitioner that would be in this overlay zone doing a site inventory of the trees and that kind of thing. And you already have a woodlands ordinance too, so you guys have drafted all of these kinds of things before anyway, so you have a great consultant who's worked with all of these communities that we've worked with, so.
In your Ann Arbor Township,
Mhm.
these 100-foot setbacks,
Mhm.
does that include man-made ponds?
No. I mean, you might not know they're man-made until it comes to the board and looking at it for a while.
What's the fourth one?
And then it's, that would be the millage program. So that would be taking your PDR, existing PDR ordinances and having a way to fund some land protection. And then the last one would be the most interesting one, because I don't know if it's been done, but you do talk about it, and you already have in your master plan this great, like I said, this great land use pattern of your urban services district and your hamlet area and the open space. And you were talking about that the soils are hard to perk. And you also already have a provision in your zoning ordinance for non-contiguous PUD, right? So you can have a developer who wants to have density in one area and take the density from a different parcel that they own, but it's not contiguous to that parcel, right? So that's essentially, basically a transfer of development rights. And so I would love to work with you more on doing something proactive with that. So you have the provision in your ordinance, so if someone wants to approach you to do that, that's great. But I would love to take a look at a map like this and say, well, out in this area where you're not encouraging development, maybe we could make some of these parcels an area that we would transfer development rights from into areas where you would like to see So I'd be really interested in, if there's any interest in the township doing that. If Webster Township is interested in that as well.
Isn't that what Kale did?
So you might have an example already.
Kale.
Right, their mitigation property?
Yeah.
That was mitigation. I think what Chris is talking about is doing something where you would allow for a greater density than what was
Yeah.
already permitted in a particular district as a trade-off for preserving some land outright in another area of the township. So in other words,
Right.
Similar to open space planning, but more in a zone area, right?
on
On
a
a
more of a
large
regional.
scale. Yeah, yeah. Mhm.
Yeah.
Or I wonder if anyone has done a similar, increased the density on their parcel and paid into the land protection program.
Mhm.
I wonder if anyone has done it that way.
Well, I
So
don't-
would- So they could pay into your PDR program?
Right. So we don't have that provision here in Salem.
No, right.
But I am aware of communities that
But
have
that
transfer of
would-
development rights where they're outright buying another piece of land that they're
Right.
preserving, but paying
Right.
into a protection fund might be something as well.
Mhm,
I have a question.
Yeah.
You said that one plating company polluted the Huron River?
For that particular, it seems like it, from what they were detecting of that PFAS.
Well, I live on Gallery Lake and can't eat the fish.
Uh-huh.
Is that the same company?
Yeah, it's in that chain.
Yes.
It's amazing, isn't it?
That's
It's
sound.
you know that movie has anyone heard of that movie Dark Waters? It came out in the fall, Dark Waters, that's what it's about PFAS. It's about the origin of where that came from and why they manufactured that chemical, and it's a forever chemical, it doesn't break down like in forever, and so that's why it's affecting, from one place, it's affecting all of the water because it just spreads out and it doesn't degrade.
9 lakes that you can't eat the fish in.
Yeah, well, it only takes tiny amounts to make the fish inedible. And it's all statistical, right? It's not like if you eat the fish, you'll die the next day.
Well, there's
If
still
you
people
eat the
fishing.
fish, you'll have a much higher risk of it.
Chris, it's amazing though too that a chrome plating company would be dumping that in there because they have such strict
Well,
wastewater
that's the
treatment
thing.
plants
Mhm.
within the chrome plating company.
Yeah.
'Cause they have sludge that they have to process, they have their own water treatment plants in those chrome plating companies.
And they were abiding by the current regulations, and they'd actually switched to this particular type, there's many kinds of thousands of chemicals that are called PFAS. And they had switched to this from a different chemical they were using to try to be more safe. But then this one turned out to be
Worse.
dangerous as well.
Bring up your.
I got this article out of last Friday's paper, and I have, if you haven't seen this regarding the federal government dropping,
Oh, yeah,
you're gonna start dropping some
Yes.
wetlands and
Yes.
waterway
yeah, that's just not good news.
articles.
Mhm.
You can have it.
Thank you.
Did you want to comment on that?
It's not good news. It was litigated back during when Obama was president, because that was, the EPA during the Obama administration had put out this Waters of the US rule that was clarifying some parts of the Clean Water Act that had to do with these streams and wetlands that were not like obviously connected to navigable, like the Huron River. And that's about half of the watershed, half of any given watershed is more of the ephemeral streams and wetlands that they dry up in the summer, but they're still wetlands. I mean, that's what wetlands are like. And so what this is doing is basically simplifying the Clean Water Act to only apply to those larger bodies of water, and making it difficult for communities to keep pollution out of waterways, basically. Now, we're kind of lucky in the state of Michigan in that we have our own laws. We have our own wetlands law. The state of Michigan has its own wetlands law and surface water protection law. So I need to talk with some of the state environmental organizations to figure out what this means for Michigan and for us specifically, but it is not good news overall for water. So let me know if you wanna, I have examples of ordinances for all those bullets. So I didn't wanna make a lot of paper for tonight, so I'm happy to give you anything and come to another meeting. Another thing I thought of is if there was a subcommittee that could be formed that wanted to work on some of the language, I'd be happy to participate in that as well. So take a read at that document I gave you and let me know what you think.
Okay, well, thank you.
I know for the benefit of any mapping exercise, wherever land preservation, we'd like to
Yeah.
help out on that to try and look at, really where some of those areas are.
Yeah, I'd be happy to work with you on that too. And you still have a copy of that final map of this, so I'll take this back with me. So is the parks and open space, is that a final or is it still on that?
That was approved by the board, so we
Okay.
can now submit it to
Great.
the state
Yes, by Sunday.
by Sunday. Oh,
February 2nd.
oh yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Real quick.
I need to talk to the clerk about a couple of things, but yes, we're trying to get that done.
I hope that we get it maybe.
Okay.
We will.
Chris, thank you very much. We really appreciate it,
Sure.
and I'm sure we'll be
Good,
in touch seeing you
Great.
again.
yes. Thank you for
Okay,
the cord.
alrighty. Where am I? New business items. Meeting schedule.
Meeting schedule should have been in your packets, just laid out the dates. Essentially, it's this third Monday of every month, except for these first 2 months, where we push it back a week because of national holidays.
Yep.
So unless there's any thoughts or concerns about this, a motion to accept it would be.
I have a concern with December 21st.
Okay.
Is there a reason why we can't go to December 14th? Because 21st is Christmas week completely. You got
Sure.
Thursday and Friday is, and I don't want to pressure the ladies.
Well, your bylaws don't require you to meet 12 months of the year, so you can either move the date or you can.
Well, and just in case we had something, I would like to prefer put the 14th, so we do have a date.
Okay. Seems appropriate.
That's the only thing I would like to amend on that.
The board would be meeting is the second Tuesday.
That's
First
the
is
8th.
Tuesday, so the board is still meeting on the 8th.
Yeah. The board meets on the 8th, and then we would meet the 14th.
And what's the purpose of that?
It's Christmas week. You got, at the end of the week, the Friday and Thursday and Friday is the 24th and 25th. And myself, I just look at it, no.
Everybody goes out of town, goes see their grandkids or whatever.
Oh, okay.
With that.
It doesn't matter to
I'm gonna have a vote.
me if somebody's gonna make a motion.
Well, I make a motion for the notice of meetings for the Planning Commission for 2020 as submitted with the amendment for December from the 21st to the 14th.
Who's that? Bob, seconds? All those in favor of moving the December 21st meeting, 2020, to the week prior, December 14th, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? None? priorities. Well, we just want to kind of give an overview
Sure.
of what we're looking at.
So at the beginning of every year, we try to update our planning priorities list for the year, and sometimes we do update that throughout the year as new things come up or as we check things off the list. A number of these are still holdovers from last year, but I provided a little memo to give kind of an update on where we are with some of those. The two highest priorities were the sections of the zoning ordinance that dealt with the USD and the Hamlet. Those have both been before you, the USD portion, a couple of times, and so those are really ready to be moved forward. And if you guys are ready for that, we could go ahead and schedule a public hearing for next month, at which time you would hold a public hearing for public comments. You guys can discuss them. There's still the opportunity to make changes at that point, but ultimately you make a recommendation for any zoning ordinance amendments to the board. So after you've held that obligatory public hearing, then you could make that motion. Obviously, if there were changes that you could make, you could condition that recommendation to the board on any changes that you want to see. So we would, if you're all okay with that, intend to bring that back next month. For that. I think there were a couple other general zoning ordinance updates that we talked about too, that were just some cleanup things on a staff level that we brought before you, and we would try to do that at the same time. A couple of these things we did talk about tonight, specifically the wind and solar. I have reached out to I guess, local expert, a professor who has been given a grant through the state to actually help communities work on their solar and wind ordinance. So she could actually come here and do a presentation, maybe similar to the one we saw tonight, but very specific to our ordinance. In fact, I've already sent her the memos that you all looked at last year in terms of the updates, and kind of briefed her on some of the issues that we're looking at here. And so I believe she was available on the March meeting. So if you're all okay with that, I would go ahead and see if we could invite her out to do that. We can keep pushing that thing forward if you'd like.
Wind and solar, right?
Yeah, wind and solar. Robert, it looks like you've got a question or comment.
We're gonna have a time in the future to talk a little more on the land use table,
Sure.
as far as permitted and non-permitted uses. We talked about that a few months back. I was wondering if there's gonna be some more opportunity for discussion on that.
Sure. So I guess my next point would be that
What time?
as go ahead.
Well, the next few months or something.
The land use table. Okay. So I would add that to under section number 1, zoning ordinance amendments, land use table. And I would ask if there are any other items that you guys want to look at here. I actually, since the time that I made this last week and sent it out to you, there were 2 other thoughts that popped into my head for this. Woodlands protection. We do have a woodlands protection ordinance, but it's, in my opinion, as the administrator of that, a little cumbersome and kind of awkward, so that might be something we want to look at. I think it could become more simple and you know, better tool for what we wanted to do. And then we've had some issues with lighting over this past year, and so I think that might be something that we want to take a look at and see if we can hone that a little bit as well.
Like what issues?
Lights going up without permits, residential exemptions well, basically for anything if it's less than 30 feet. And so with newer technologies, especially kind of the LED lights that tend to be very bright, glare is the biggest thing that becomes a nuisance when it comes to lighting. And so, you know, in the past, if you've put a bare bulb on the side of your house above your door or what have you, it's thought of as residential lighting, no big deal. But if you can put up a, you know, I don't know what the wattage on these LED things are, but you can see it for miles and miles. So, yeah, so it's
like a basketball court.
yeah.
Oh, like Price store? Oh, you got trouble for it?
Yeah.
Bad.
The whole road.
Bad bond.
I thought we were just gonna put something in the parking lot. It ended up You could play basketball on the road.
Yeah. Well, and so that's the thing. I think a lot of business owners, homeowners don't necessarily know, and they hire somebody to come out and do this. They put
Sure.
the latest and greatest technology up there, and then all of a sudden it's
I can see
stays
how
on
that
at night.
happens.
So I think it's something worth looking at.
Okay, sounds good.
I don't have any particular draft ordinance at this point, but depending on where you think of that as priority, or if we can get through some of these other things, we'll bring that.
Well, some of these, I guess it depends on, some of these things might be more cumbersome than others,
Mhm.
and more involved, I should say. So,
Well, I will just list these guys as the low priority. The land use, is that something that you want to have as like a medium, Robert? Yeah. We talked a little bit about the wastewater just during this last presentation. We have drafted an ordinance. It's been under review. It's just something that we need to work. This is not, doesn't go in the zoning ordinance, so it's something that would actually ultimately go through the board. So we kind of have to work with the township board, the township legal consultants, and see where we can move with that.
which one are you talking about?
The community
Oh,
wastewater
yes.
system.
Yeah,
So that's been in the process.
it's, yeah, we're working on it.
We're working on it, yeah.
It's in Ed's court.
Um,
I put the woodlands protection and lighting update as a medium,
Okay,
because I think we're gonna have some slow months coming up,
okay.
and let's get some of these things done while we can before Showstack comes back or whenever they're coming back. And
Okay.
then we'll be busy.
Yes, fair enough. Wetland ordinance, I think that's probably also something, we dealt with that kind of the first time as a group with the KALO. It might be something at least to take a look at and see if it's, the best tool at this point, if we need to update it or what have you. I think many of these wetland ordinances were all drafted kind of around the same time, so I think it might be appropriate to look into them and see if they're still the latest and greatest language that it could be or what have you, so.
Couple things, it mentions that in the ordinance that there's a map on file with the township.
Mhm.
What's the official, what are the official maps?
Yeah.
Some of these things that, again, to at least question before you develop it, make sure it is or is not.
And then, I guess some of the things that Chris talked about a moment ago could be things that we look at as well, like thinking about the additional setback requirements, vegetated buffer, I think those would go together. Overlay zone, I think I'd like to look a little more about what she's suggesting in particular there, but we could, potentially increase open space or impervious requirements, or look at ways that we can reduce those as investment practices. We do, our township engineering standards do reference the county standards, so I don't know if you caught that, but in the case where the county has jurisdiction because they're actually having to get a permit to discharge their county drain, then the county would review it based on their standards. In areas where they're not required to get a permit, then our township engineers are still reviewing their stormwater plan based on those same county standards. So we were one of the communities with a smiley face there.
Oh, yay. Go Salem.
That transfer of development rights, that would be a much larger kind of discussion to take on. So I think we've got plenty on our plate right here to look at. I mean, we can certainly put that on there as maybe a low priority to also consider. The nice thing about this table is we can keep things on here so that they don't go away, so we can continue
Yeah.
to see them. We don't have to do everything, but some of these things we can place on there, so something to consider.
I think that particular item is worth just constantly, just looking and absorbing what's out there, because it's gonna be a big, like you said, big item, a big sell to, wrap our heads around that and how's it look and what would it actually look like.
Yeah.
There's gonna be a lot of people not understanding it, et cetera, so you gotta do some serious math to figure, to make it make sense.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And one of the issues, as we're having people build on adjacent to wetlands, that the wetland setback, the builder wants to build a lot of times right on the setback.
Right.
So then the people buy that unit, and they find out they can't build in the back of their house because it's the setback for the wetlands.
Right.
They don't, can we enforce a setback, a building setback from the setback, or, you know what I'm saying?
So I think that,
I think we did have something like that, and I think we gave relief, I think maybe to Showstack on that.
yeah, we gave relief to Showstack on a lot of stuff on that first initial PUD. I think it was a reduction in the required buffer. I think that it would be helpful if in our ordinance we had more explicit language that said what could and could not happen in the buffer. So we require the buffer, but it doesn't explicitly say that you can't grade in the buffer. And so, you know, if we say, okay, we can't build in the buffer, you can't grade in the wetland, but there's no language that says you can't grade in the buffer, then you're kind of destroying the buffer in the development process. The other issue, and I think this speaks more to your point, is that while the building envelope may not be in the wetland may encroach into the yard. And so, like you say, they will build right within their building envelope, but then the backyard is encumbered by wetlands. And so then the homeowner comes in there and they want to fill that area. Or even when they go to do the grading for the lot itself, you know, while they don't show that.
They want to build out in the back.
Right, so maybe they don't show that grading during the mass grading in the site plan that we're looking at, but in order to build an individual house, you would have to do that. So I think maybe adding some language that says that, you know, wetland buffers cannot be part of a lot would be simple and explicit, and then it would take the guesswork away, because I know that I was having that conversation with the township engineer specifically about this Salem Springs residential piece. So, it's a good point.
Did we add that to our list?
Yeah, so I guess that would go under zoning ordinance. So then, the master plan item is blank because we did do the Parks and Rec plans, that moved down to completed projects, and we did the master plan update, that moved down to completed projects. And, you know, in case you're feeling like we didn't do a lot necessarily last year, the next item is the annual report that we put together for you to send to the board, show what activities the planning commission engaged in over the last year. Because there are quite a few things that you did accomplish. While we still have some items to polish off from last year's list, we did push a number of things forward. So, any other discussion or comments, anything you want to see added to this list at this point?
Bruce, did you have anything from your, because I have a copy of the email you sent.
Yeah, well, as you said in the annual report, we did a lot of things, but we obviously, as you also pointed out, we didn't close some things, so I guess it'd feel better if we kind of keep pushing some of the land review and ordinance, we push it. So we don't have to revisit now, we're all gonna have to kind of reread the stuff and kind of get our head back into that particular ordinance.
Sure.
You know, we're counting on you to put all the best practices and all the stuff that we talked about in there, and we're really counting on you to make sure that is covered, because, you know, we're sometimes getting these things fragmented.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, we want to make sure we don't get, not only doing something that may or may not work out well, but also having to deal with being corrected by others because we catch something because we've been doing it fragmented.
Fair enough.
Like Paul said, the wind and solar that's on here, you know, I remember these things and we didn't come to a conclusion and we didn't provide any direction for him, and I think that's because we didn't know enough.
Right.
So to create an ordinance uninformed and uneducated not a good idea.
Yeah, and
The
so,
stakes and blah, 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 so Paul is gonna bring someone in, so we have discussed that. The grading and the berm slope, you know, there was all kinds of discussion, and then I think we had, you know, some field trips, individual field trips out, so maybe we can visit that one, but that could be something we could quickly check off the list too. Yeah, that was it. In the septic, like, that it came up, that has come up in when a developer will come in, has brought that forward. I think it's important to a lot of people, so Paul has been working on that, and then there were some issues, legal issues that Ed wanted to wait till they shook out, because there was something in the middle. We didn't want to create something when there was an issue with that particular, in a different community. We wanted to kind of, so sometimes we kind of want to wait and see before we jump into something and do what they did, and we're in trouble just like they are, one way or another. You know, so some of these things have a little bit of a waiting period, but it's, they haven't dropped off the list.
well, but I think Bruce does make a good point, and thank you for saying that, but, you know, like, a couple of these I could have brought back more quickly, so we could have kept them fresher. You know, the wind and the solar was kind of on a lower priority ranking, but to Bruce's point, you know, to come back with more information immediately when it was still fresh might have been a better way to tackle that one. But I think that if we are able to bring in this person who I had the opportunity to see speak last year, they may be able to, you know, not only help look at our ordinance and provide some best practices, but also listen to kind of the sentiment of you all on the board and help to provide some guidance about what the best practices for this community would be.
The object is not to get caught not having anything in place, and again, someone brings a proposal to the table, you've got to act on it, and if you discourage it without having prior ordinances, wherever, discussing the limits for the, you know, obviously you got to allow everything and anything to a certain degree, but you have to have the rules and limits on how they affect the people around it. It's just something we don't know anything about that, and I appreciate you very much for bringing in something, because we just don't know. So the only way to deal with sometimes is what you don't know is to put too many rules in place, and it's better to do it right the first time if you know somebody's got some good best practices and more information that we can think about, just like the land rights and things like that for density. Same thing is true on that as well.
Yeah, better to do it right the first time, because you know how long it takes us to get it done.
Well, again, and wish we could, if there were magic words in you know, in language that would help identify some of this stuff, because again, people say in New Hampshire about, you know, rural character, define that. Well, each one of us have a different definition of what rural character is. But by the same token, some of our things that we are putting in place, and I'm sorry, I'm gonna make the berm as the example, but you know, if you've got a berm and a nice developed, you have some developed neighborhoods, and it's maintained very scruffy and, you know, not maintained, but it's allowed to grow scruffy, it's out in the front yard, that might be a little bit objectionable for some of the neighborhoods that we have, but yet, you know, a place that is basically a wooded area to start with, or a rural area to start with at some point, it may be very appropriate to let it grow natural, and actually let that natural vegetation be there for the wild, the habitat, whoever needs to use it. So it's how do you put that into, it's okay for you, but not for you,
Right.
into the language, but yet that's kind of really what we want. Here is where it's appropriate, but here is where it should be in character with the surrounding versus in character for an entire 6 square miles by, or 6 miles by 6 miles, 36 square mile community. It's quite a bit different between one and the other, you know, especially if we have the USD and that's all built out nicely. It's gonna be a whole lot different than 6 miles down the road.
Yeah, for sure, that's the struggle that we as planners, you as planning commissioners are tasked with, is putting language that's in place to extract what you want, but do it appropriately and, you know, not be burdensome to your community. Now, just using that example, presumably in MSD, if they create this neighborhood, they are gonna have a whole set of bylaws and requirements that they then can enforce upon themselves, that we don't necessarily have to do.
You just brought up another item I had on my list in the background, but being that it's coming, we need to look at where association rules kick in, or rules that can be assigned to, because I know we have this agreement with the Showstack people for that one development, but, you know, subdivision rules or whatever, association rules, where do we get involved with, what responsibilities do we have to make sure they're in place and enforced, or vice versa, that, you know, I would much rather let that community, so to speak, set their rules and not have to be, as a township, forced to get involved with their.
So we as a township do not have the authority or the responsibility to enforce neighborhood association rules. Typically, when a new development comes in that has master deed and bylaws, we would take a look at those as part of the final review of the development, to ensure that some of the things that need to be in there based on our rules are there. But ultimately, once that neighborhood is done and approved and those bylaws are accepted, then it's really on the homeowners association, the developer, to enforce those rules. And in fact, once they've gotten their approval from us, they can go and amend those, as long as it doesn't create something that's contrary to an approved site plan, which is our governing document for that development, or a development agreement, which we can also require through a PUD. Then we look at them, we say, okay, this makes sense for the neighborhood, but then it's up to the neighborhood to deal with that.
But do we need to have a minimum standard or anything in place as our responsibility? Or can we just look at it and say, yeah, that looks good? Or do we need to at least say, you have to have at least this in there? Especially when you got one neighborhood being built next to another neighborhood, their rules might be much tighter than theirs, and the one going, hey, I still gotta look at the backyard of the guy next door.
No, I mean, we would have those things in our ordinances. The only things that we would be stringent about would be what we have in our ordinance. We certainly want our attorney to look at those, the bylaws, an initial look at them to make sure that it's not inconsistent with the plans that we approve.
So we don't need to worry about it, makes us what I'm asking.
Yes, correct.
We'll worry about it or feel that we have a pressure of liability there.
Correct.
Thank you.
All righty. Anything else on our planning priorities?
Thanks for that discussion. I will update these and get you a copy back at our next meeting. And then, like I said, we can continue to update it throughout the year as we need to.
Just one more question. So the general review of the zoning ordinance and the zoning ordinance updates, those are you, and you're working on those to prepare those for the public hearing?
Yes.
Correct?
Yep.
Okay. Alrighty.
So the annual report, I think, could just take a simple motion to accept.
So does it need to be read in the minutes, or we go with that?
I think it's fine.
Okay. Okay, I'll make a motion that we support the annual report as drafted here in our meeting notes and submit to the board.
I second.
All those in favor of submitting the 2019 annual report as submitted to the board, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? None? Old business? None? Reports of commissioners and correspondence. Board of Trustees, TJ's not here. ZBA,
We had a meeting in January 8th. It was brought up from last November. We had two applicants, one on Sunset Drive, I believe it is. He wanted a 25-foot easement relief from the wetlands in back, because he had front and back wetlands. And they sold the property to build a home. And the original guy wants like 5,000 square foot, but the potential new owner only wants a small ranch of like 1,800 to, am I correct? And they said, well, if it's a small one, then it could virtually, the wetlands, everybody says it shouldn't be nothing there. But then one neighbor said it would be nice to have a neighbor. And we did approve that, didn't we? Yes. That one was approved. And the one on Chubb Road, they had a kind of a garage barn type thing, was kind of deteriorating, and they wanted to replace it, but keep it in the same spot. And that was approved for that person there. It wasn't that he was building it bigger or moving it back either way. He was just going to tear it down because there was no footing under the garage, and it kept shifting, and the cement blacktop was cracking. So he decided it's time to put up a new one. But it's in the same place, but everything was approved that we had for the two applicants.
He decided he wanted to replace it 2 years ago.
Yeah.
It took him a year and a half before he finally submitted a ZBA
Yes.
application.
why did he have to go to the ZBA just to replace it?
Because the existing was a non-conforming, so.
Land preservation, conservation?
Okay, we just had our meeting and we set our goals as well. We're looking at a couple of, preserve a few properties as well as keep up with the trails and the stuff that we'd like to improve on at the Salem Farm Preserve. And I understand we're waiting for the contract on the farm property itself to involve the trails, so.
Oh,
So wait for the board on that one. Other than that, we're looking.
I have nothing more to add.
Oh, home too.
I apologize, I used last year's agenda, and so. I
There's no
bounced it to
chairman
you.
comments on
There's
there?
no chairman comments on here, I just
I was
saw
gonna
that,
mention
so
that, but
I apologize.
not in front of the camera.
So I'm
That's
writing
okay.
E on mine.
Okay. Approval of November 18th minutes. Oh,
I'd like to
Time ago.
approve the minutes of November 18th, 2019 as submitted.
Have a second?
I'll second it.
All those in favor of approving the November 18th, 2019 minutes as submitted, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? None? Okay, public comment.
I sat here all through the presentation and I saw everything she said and I listened this time. I didn't play games on my computer.
Because Linda wasn't here.
That's not how I did this over here. Anyways, I heard her tell you, and you all said, oh, this is a wonderful idea. She said, you put all the property, all the density of population in this spot, you leave all the rest of your township empty. And she illustrated it in about 3 different ways. Well, I'm telling you right now, people move out here to be away from other people. We don't move into subdivisions unless they have huge lots. We don't move into, well, I don't know what they're gonna do in the USD, but most of us don't move into a place where we've got neighbors that are so close that we can't yell at our kids and they take care of us. And that's the first reason I moved out here, is because if I ever have a child, which I did, I could yell at her and the neighbors wouldn't come over and say what happened. So if you're going to write your laws and your master plan and everything, so that you get little enclaves of property owners, you're gonna lose the rural character that we tried so hard to keep here. Thank you.
Chairman comment coming in after that. Go
I've been
ahead.
hearing the
Oh,
same thing since about 1968. Open,
right.
no congestion.
Okay, so now Chairman Commerce. I did not hear one person say, oh yeah, that's great, we're gonna do this, let's start writing those laws right now. Bonnie, I just wanna say, what's that? No, we sat here and we smiled and we listened respectfully. Nobody, I did not hear one person agree with anything, because I know that a lot of us were thinking, and I would be willing to bet that there were a number of things that a number of people didn't agree with. So I'm just saying that to calm your nerves, because I know what you're saying. I've heard that philosophy before, when I first came here, which was, I don't know, but anyhow, and nothing has really changed. And so what I'm saying is, I understand what both of you are saying, but you've got to be careful. We did not, before you say, hey, you guys are doing this, stop it, we didn't really do anything. We just listened, and and a lot of times, I'll say to the camera, if you see me smile or shake my hand, it's more of an understanding and acknowledgement of someone who's speaking to me, because our role is to sit up here and listen to everyone and take it in. But I think we have a track record of doing that and doing okay so far.
I think the whole room moved here for the same reason.
Yeah. So I don't want to, I'm not going to say, oh, we disagree with most. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying we were listening, and I understand what you're saying. And I think a lot of people have a lot of different thoughts, but it was just a listening session. Okay. Adjourned at 9:07.